So today I'd like to discuss quite a fascinating maamar torah of the Rebbe Maharash. Now I think it may be fair to say that within the category of Chabad toros, the Rebbe Maharash is sometimes sandwiched in the middle, and to a certain extent can be said to be perhaps the most obscure, because Alter Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek have certain, at least at a minimum, have certain classical works that most will take a look at, and the Rebbe Rashab, the Rebbe's Torah is part of the curriculum in yeshiva. But the Rebbe Maharash, of course, there are some famous in Shechem, but it's advanced extra learning. It's not something that you would necessarily come across in yeshiva. And within the Rebbe Maharash's Torah specifically, perhaps we can argue that this particular Torah is doubly obscure because we do not have this Torah, as far as I'm aware, we do not have this Torah as the Rebbe Maharash wrote it. Rebbe Maharash wrote most or close to all of his Torahs, his maamarim. And when you look at the set, the red set of maamarim of Rebbe Maharash, so you'll often see that earlier years it's just the Rebbe Maharash, and then in later years, as the Rebbe Rashab got old enough to start recording the maamarim as he heard them, so the volumes may be divided in half, or 2/3 of 3/4, depending on the year or the volume of the volume. So 2/3, 3/4 might be the Rebbe Maharash, and then you have the analogies of Rebbe Rashab in the back for comparison's sake. So you have the way the Rebbe Maharash wrote it, then you have the way the Rebbe Rashab wrote it down as it was said, perhaps, or perhaps the Rebbe Rashab was also looking at using his father's notes. That's a whole separate discussion. I don't know how many people are even aware, to the extent of how little people look at the Maharash. I don't know how many people are aware that we have all of these analogies of the Rebbe Rashab writing the Rebbe Maharash's toros before he even began writing his own toros. Obviously, the Rebbe Maharash passed away when he was very young, and we already have the Rebbe Rashab's writings from after that. That's part of the Rebbe Rashab set from Tafresh Mem Gimel and on. But we have writings of the Rebbe Rashab going back many years before that, from when he was, I don't remember now, 14, 15, pretty young. He began writing his father's Torah. So at any rate, you have the Rebbe Maharash's writings, but you also have the Rebbe Rashab, but you also have other hanachas. Occasionally, there were other chassidim who, we know the history in Chabad, there were those whose job it was, or who just voluntarily on their own wrote a hanacha, wrote their own version of the Torah as the Rebbe said it. And the Rebbe Maharash also had chassidim who wrote hanachas. Interestingly, often we don't seem to have any information about who they were. So if the information was known, they would write, this is hanacha by so-and-so. For the Tzemach Tzedek, we'll say the hanacha of the Reb Hill, hanacha of Reb Bertel Kalisker, he was a big chayzer maniach of the Tzemach Tzedek, or hanacha of Reb Meshel Gelbstein. There are some big names for the Tzemach Tzedek. If you ever venture that far, past the Derech Mitzvah, past the Ohr Hachaim into the hanachas of the Tzemach Tzedek, so you'll see those names, or the Rebbe Maharash. The Maharash wrote hanachas of the Tzemach Tzedek also from whichever age, in his teens, as we'll mention in a moment. When it comes to Rebbe Maharash, I think as a rule, we don't typically know who the chassidim writing these hanachas were, whether it was one particular chassid who wrote a bunch or different people. But they also have value, particularly if you don't have the hanacha of the Rebbe Rashab, but even if you do, sometimes the hanachas of the Rebbe Rashab are incomplete. So sometimes we have a maamar of the Rebbe Maharash in 3 different versions. So in this case, however, we do not, it's a maamar of the Rebbe Maharash that for some reason we do not have the ksav, the lashon of the Rebbe Maharash. We don't have enough of the Rebbe Rashab because it was too early. It's Tafresh Lamed. The Rebbe Rashab wasn't bar mitzvah yet. But we have an anonymous hanacha of this Torah of the Rebbe Maharash. It wasn't even printed in the first edition of Sefer Tafresh Lamed. It was printed in the second edition in Tafshim Mem Gimel. They wrote, we found a number of additional hanachas, taka stuff that wasn't written by the Rebbe Maharash. The first edition was mostly or all the Rebbe Maharash himself, and then they found a few hanachas, so they included them as well. So in order to find this, you have to open Tafresh Lamed, which is one of the older volumes. It's of the set that we have today. You have stuff that was printed in the last 20, 30 years. It looks newer, it's computer typed. Then you have some of the volumes that are older, printed in the Lameds. So, the Tafshin Lameds. So in this case, this is one of the older volumes, and it's all the way in the back on the surface, page Shinun Beis and onward. What is interesting, what is unique about this torah of the Rebbe Maharash. So for that, I want to give just a bit of background. But before I go on, I just want to point out, for those listening, or if you're playing it in earshot of others, that this discussion, this maamar, is interesting, and particularly because it touches on some, what you could say, are adult themes. So depending on who you have around, if you're uncomfortable, obviously I will try to keep the lashon, the sprach, the language, edel. So we'll talk about things like the libido, or we'll talk about the intimacy or a person's drive, but we won't use more explicit words and terms. But that's the nature of the discussion that's about to ensue, and that's, like I said, that's what makes it interesting, as I'll explain what the nature of this maamar, this torah is, and why it's so interesting. So by way of background, I could say that this episode, if you want to call it, is inspired in part by Ben Tziyavtzin. Ben Tziyavtzin is a name that most of those listening are probably familiar with. He's been putting himself out there for the last couple of years, interviewing people, having interesting discussions about Chabad. And in addition, he also has online postings that I sometimes see, that I sometimes engage in. So most recently, he was asking about the attitude towards nida and the framework, the framing, how we present the concept of nida, the halachas, the separation, and the emphasis there is today on how it's positive, it contributes to the relationship. And he was asking about the origins of that framing, the framework. There is such a concept in the Gemara, but I don't want to get into that whole topic right now. But that was one discussion that we had recently, and I was commenting, I was responding, I was talking about how the Frierdiker Rebbe, who was the first to sort of begin a campaign to engage the larger public to promote toros hamishpacha, which is itself is a modern term, as also came up in that conversation. Toros hamishpacha is sort of a modern euphemism that's said to have originated in Germany, perhaps in German, and then translated into Hebrew, other languages, which is itself a rebrand of the concept. What type of writings, what type of promotional material the Frierdiker Rebbe promoted, which is somewhat different than the stuff you hear today. Again, not getting directly into that right now, but that was one conversation we had recently. Another topic, another theme that I've seen him touch on, which is of interest to me, is I've seen him mention a number of times that he had some friends that the day after they got married, they were talking in terms of they feel more spiritual. The experience is making them feel like they're unlocking some new spiritual dimension. I don't recall having friends that said that, so I can't speak for who they were and what they meant. But that's what he reports hearing from friends, and he's expressed that he finds that amusing or funny, or essentially they're confused, and they're confusing two different things. They're confusing their emotions or their hormones or whatever, which a good bach in yeshiva sort of, let's say, locks away, throws away the key, compartmentalizes, and then finally, once a bacher in yeshiva gets married, so that aspect of their life gets unlocked. So that's what they're experiencing, and they're just confusing, conflating it with some sense of spirituality, because another question that many of us deal with is, chassidus always talks about this very rich spirituality, and it always seems sort of off limits, out of reach for us, which is another topic I have been looking into lately, and maybe for an upcoming discussion soon. Chabad spirituality and hisbonenus and davening and all of that, but often that also sort of feels out of reach. So suddenly, with this part of their being, their psyche being unlocked, so in his opinion, they were sort of confusing and conflating the two things. He's not the only person who's mentioned a connection to this, a link to this lately. There's someone else who had a discussion that was posted online where this topic or a version of it came up as well, where he sort of expressed it the other way. He said that he thinks teenagers who are drawn to spirituality, it's really masking their baser, more biological desires, and it's just being channeled into seeking a spiritual outlet, whereas as that person presented it, maybe all they just need is a physical outlet in that sense, in that context. They're just looking for physical intimacy. So these are some examples of how this topic came up recently, and these are certainly questions that interest me very much. And I think, obviously, like in terms of the propriety and how to go about having this conversation, that's a valid and important question. But I do think these questions have to be discussed in some form. So with those questions lingering in the back of my mind, this past Shabbos, I went over to the shelf after davening in my house, and I davened in shul, and I came back to my house, and I went over to the shelf in my house, and I took a Sefer Tafresh Mem Beis. Tafresh Mem Beis is the last full year, the last volume of the set of the Rebbe Maharash, because the Rebbe Maharash passed away in Tishrei Mem Gimel, and usually the maamar of Tishrei, at least in that kufa, the maamar of Tishrei were considered the end and the hemshech to the previous year's maamarim anyway. So whatever there might be from Mem Gimel would be included in Mem Beis anyway. So Mem Beis is the final volume. It's also, I think, the one that was printed the most recently. So it's the newest and maybe has the most ha'aris. Anyway, why am I going over to the shelf and taking off the Rebbe Maharash off the shelf? So that itself is an interesting question. Like I said, it's not so popular to look at Rebbe Maharash. So first of all, I like to look at the things that aren't popular. That's just in principle. But I also do think that the Mamarim and Dafka, the lesser known Mamarim of the Alter Rebbe, Mittel Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, and Maharash, do hold many ideas and messages that we are perhaps missing out on by sticking to the more prescribed, standard, classical stuff they learn in yeshiva. I'll also point out that the Rebbe himself did not adhere, by my estimation, did not adhere at all to these types of limitations that we're familiar with from yeshiva. If you look through the years, look through the Mamarim, what are the Rebbe's Mamarim based on? Because generally the Rebbeim would say Mamarim that were based on the Mamarim of previous Rebbeim. If you look at what the Rebbe's Mamarim are based on, or if you look at what Mamarim the Rebbe mentioned by name, spoke about in Farbrengens, often the Rebbe would get Bichlach, Amal, before Chabad's culture of publication shifted to print. I probably have mentioned this in previous videos on other channels. The main culture of learning, of dissemination, was through handwritten copies, and those those handwritten mamarim would be collected in notebooks and bichlach, and then every chassid had sort of his personal bichel with perhaps the mamarim that he chose, he hand-selected, that he found of interest, that he found relevant and have resonance. So there were dozens or hundreds of personal bichlach. And many of them could contain stuff that everyone else had, but then occasionally each bichel could have something that other bichlach don't have. This is in addition to the kisvei yad of the Rebbeim. The Rebbeim kept entire notebooks of the toros that they wrote. But in addition to that, every chassid might have his own bichel with a few toros of the Alter Rebbe, Mittel Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek. And throughout the years, these bichlach sort of made their way to the Rebbe's library. And every time the Rebbe got a new bichel, chashuv bichel, the Rebbe would speak about it, and the Rebbe would choose something, and short Ramar without the Rebbe, all kinds of deep cuts that you would never hear about in yeshiva. That is actually very much a big part of what the Rebbe, you could say, Kachzachin, spoke about. So I don't know if it's appropriate to say I'm in good company, but I think this is actually, taking this kind of interest is actually fairly in line with the pattern of the Rebbe's learning and the Rebbe's speaking. And like I alluded to in a recent video, a recent recording, I sort of like to analyze what is the Rebbe learning, what is the Rebbe talking about, what are the patterns in the Rebbe's, like I said, the fancy word would be the intellectual profile. What is the Rebbe actually occupying himself with? Because often the idea is out there, you have to learn what the Rebbe learns, his kashrus. But what does that actually mean? To me, that's actually very notable, very much of interest. What is the Rebbe learning, and can we rearrange our lens, our perspective, to be looking at the landscape of learning from the vantage point of where the Rebbe is looking at the landscape of learning from? So this is something I think about. So, like I said, I think if I may say, it's good company to be looking at the Mamarim of the Rebbeim. And we know the Rebbe had a certain chavivus. It's well known the Rebbe had a certain chavivus for the Mamarim of the Rebbe Maharash. The Rebbe was involved in printing them in the 1940s and onwards. The Rebbe had of all the Rebbeim, the Rebbe had a special shaykhs to printing the torahs of the Rebbe Maharash. I believe there were certain times, I think Sukkot, in the Sukkah, the Rebbe would look at the torah of the Rebbe Maharash. So there's certainly very strong precedent. I don't have to defend myself by any means. But in addition, if you actually are on the lookout for what is interesting, which is another value that I alluded to recently, I think it's important. If you actually are looking for what's interesting, there are many interesting things in the Rebbe Maharash that you will not find elsewhere, certainly not necessarily in the later doidos of chassidus. Now, part of what makes them interesting is that they are often based on Rishimas. So the Tzemach Tzedek has all kinds of interesting Rishimas, and I spend my time looking at those in their own right. But those are often written in very terse, cryptic style. You sort of have to decipher and pull apart what Tzemach Tzedek is saying. But often Rebbe Maharash would do that himself and create a more digestible maamar based on the research, based on the tziyuna and the maamar kaimis, the rishimas of the Tzemach Tzedek. So what the Tzemach Tzedek writes with a bunch of ayin shams turns into something a lot more readable and digestible and enjoyable when the Rebbe Maharash restates it. I also think that the Rebbe Maharash had a unique quality to his mamarim, in which the word that comes to mind is that they're very balabatish. I think up until then, the Alter Rebbe spoke in very lofty, soaring terms. The Mittel Rebbe stuck to the same themes as the Alter Rebbe. The Tzemach Tzedek created many other themes, and there are some differences, but still mostly based on the Alter Rebbe. Whereas, so often it's sort of speaking to what sounds like a very spiritually advanced crowd. Whereas the Maharash, it seems, is for the first time acknowledging that the Olam here, listening to the maamar might be a lot more pashut, a lot more balabatish, and sometimes the tone of the maamar, the messages of the maamar reflect that. And of course, later the Fidig Rebbe, to a certain extent, also has mamarim of that nature, or even the Rebbe Shab in some places. So the Rebbe Maharash's mamarim have a number of interesting qualities that actually make them very attractive and interesting. If you're just looking for an interesting geschmack maamar that's not too long or not necessarily too deep or too advanced, too technical, the Rebbe Maharash, there's a lot of stuff there. So I have my tkufas. It's hard to give all the Rabbeim equal attention, equal time at all times. So I'll cycle through tkufas. I'll be looking more at the Alter Rebbe, more at the Mittel Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, Rebbe Maharash. Of course, the Rebbe Shab, Rebbe, and the Rebbe are more of a constant. But as it happens, I actually haven't looked at the Rebbe Maharash's mamarim in a while. So this Shabbos I was inspired. I took Tafish Rambeis off the shelf, and I flipped the pages, as we say in Yiddish, geblättert to Emor, and I see it says, "Usavartem lachem chulu, nida vehefsek tara chulu, b'yoyim chasunos ezemat torah chulu, haroyes se'oinem b'chaloim Emor." So the Maharash, I'm not sure if the Tzemach said it before, but certainly the Maharash also kept mafteches of his mamarim. And in the maftech, he'd write the Dibna Maschul, and he'd write in short what the Toichen HaMaimer is, what the major themes are. So here he wrote, Nidu Hefsek Tara, three major themes that this Maimer is about. And it's a Maimer Svartim Lachem about Sphira, and it's for Parshas Emor. And this was Parshas Emor, Shabbos Parshas Emor. So I said, wow, this sounds like a potentially fascinating title of the Maharash, something I'm not surprised to see, but I wasn't specifically aware of this one. However, the problem is that the Maimer does not actually appear in the volume. It's in the Mafteach. The Maharash wrote in the Mafteach as one of the Maimer of that year. But the Maimer itself is apparently not included in the Maimer of that year. So it's not there. So where is it? So they write, take a look in Tafresh Lamed. Tafresh Lamed, you have the reverse. In Tafresh Lamed, in the list of Maimer of the Maharash, it doesn't mention Esfartam Lachem, doesn't mention anything. However, as I believe I just mentioned, there is this Hanacha, not the Rebbe Maharash's writing, not from the Rebbe Shab. There's a Hanacha from an anonymous chassid that is started to Svartim Lachem and talks about Nidav Hefsek Tara, B'yem Chasanos Ezemat Torah, Haroyes Oirim B'chaloim. So the Maimer is somehow there from Tafresh Lamed. Now the Rebbe Maharash had his system, and he would chazer certain mamarim from the earlier years and the later years. So there's nothing surprising about if he had said it in Tafresh Lamed and in Tafresh Rambeis, but there's something interesting and mysterious about the fact that it's not listed in Tafresh Lamed and only cropped up from a Hanacha and is listed in Tafresh Rambeis but doesn't appear there. We don't have it in his own writing. So it's almost like we almost lost it. We wouldn't have had it if not for this hanacha, the singular hanacha cropping up, and now we're able to actually see what the maamar is about. The one more source we have for these themes, for this content, is printed in the Rebbe Rashab's Amorim, Tafish Nun Beis. However, if you dig around, it seems like what's printed in Tafish Nun Beis is not actually the Rebbe Rashab's writing. It's actually the Rebbe Maharash's hanacha of a maamar that Tzemach Tzedek said in Tafresh Tazayin. That's what they write in the list of the Tzemach Tzedek's mamorim. So we know that the Tzemach Tzedek said it as a maamar in Tafresh Tazayin. The Rebbe Maharash wrote it down. That somehow got printed in Tafish Nun Beis. That means Rebbe Rashab was being oisik in it or copied it. It's still not fully clear to me what happened there, but all the text there seems to be the Rebbe Maharash's recording of the Tzemach Tzedek. So we have the way that Tzemach Tzedek said it as written by the Rebbe Maharash, and then we have the way that Rebbe Maharash said it as recorded in this hanacha. I don't know if this is all these details are so fascinating. To me, it's interesting, just the details behind the scenes, how we even get these maamarim at all, how they reached us. Now, if the Tzemach Tzedek said a maamar, you would expect to find perhaps in his Rishimis something along these lines. I can't say I went and looked, but I didn't see, and they're not mitzayin to anything, so it's weiter. We have it only from these two sources, both of which are hanachas, not from the original writings of the Rebbeim themselves, which is interesting. Now, another point before I go on, except for being copied into Tafresh Nun Beis, which is, by the way, a year where the Rebbe Rashab still wasn't formally engaging in the full duties of being a Rebbe. No, we're not getting into that history right now. But we don't find that often the Rebbe Rashab said mamorim based on the Rebbe Maharash, and the Fidik Rebbe said mamorim based on the Rebbe Rashab, etc. We don't find that the themes of this maamar were repeated at any point afterwards. And I want to just address that and point out another reason why it's kedai to look at the maamar of the Rebbe Maharash and earlier is because this is not very well known. I haven't heard anyone formally make this observation, but I have noticed this and I have observed this before. And that is that if you look at the maamarim and the entire body of maamarim of the earlier Rebbeim, there are many more what you could call adult themes. Themes just relating to stuff like nida, stuff like zivug ish v'ishtoi, stuff like that. Ava shebenish le'ishtoi. And this is something that in the last few years, I've been gradually taking more and more of an interest in, and sort of collecting, making notes of topics like this that are out there. But it seems fair to say that the reason why this is not familiar to people is because there's a big shift historically in Chabad from the Dur of the Rebbe Maharash and before to the Dur of the Rebbe Rashab and onward. And that is that up until the Dur of the Rebbe Maharash, the Seder was that there was no musig of Bachrim. There were no Bachrim in Lubavitch. Was haste, what were there? The way it worked is that up until then, pre-modernity, the marriage, the age of marriage for a good boy, a good bacher, someone who was going to perhaps continue learning, was somewhere around 13, 14, 15. We see that all the Rebbeim got married around 14. The Fidik Rebbe was already 15, and the Rebbe is a totally different story. That was the age in the Beis Harav. Often in the mishpachos of Rabbanim, or Gvirim who were taking the children of Rabbanim, they often wanted to chaparayin, they wanted to lock in, and that was just the culture. Not everyone got married necessarily at that young age. If you were a working boy, working as the apprentice to the shoemaker, then I don't know, maybe you got married at 18, 20, 22, maybe when you had some money and you had a future. But it seems like the ernst, good kinder bachrim that were going to continue in Yoni Ruchnias got married much younger. And from the Dur of first of all, the Alter Rebbe himself, when he started out on his journey, he was in that category. But because he started so early, so his early chassidim, by the time the Maggid passed away, which is Taf Kahama Beis, the Alter Rebbe lived for another 40 years and gradually turned into the Alter Rebbe that we know. So by the time you get to the last 10 years, the Alter Rebbe's earliest chassidim are already middle-aged. So he wasn't necessarily directly dealing with such a young light, and that's why that was Mittler Rebbe's role. Mittler Rebbe was a generation younger, and his role was to deal with these young light. But when we say young light, Younger light means from the age of potentially of 14 and up. And the term that was used back then for this category was na'arim. Interestingly, na'arim could have a connotation of younger, but that's the term that's often, Mittler Rebbe uses it a lot. And then Maharash uses it in some letters that we have. That was the term they used for so instead of Spitz Bachrim, you had Spitz Na'arim. That was the term they used. And these Na'arim were technically married, but were likely somewhat immature. And, they weren't necessarily living a full domestic life. The Rebbe mentioned in Fabrengen, his grandfather, the Seder was, you got married at the age of 14, let's say, and then you went straight to the Hoif, you went to the Rebbe Maharash or whichever door, and you sat there, you were a Yoshev, a Zitzer for a year. The Rebbe said, Tzarachion with Naki Yiyah Lebeisa, you're supposed to stay home. But the marriage wasn't, they weren't fully ripe for marriage necessarily, even by the standards then. So it wasn't so upgefrekt, I guess, to say, okay, we're married, I'll see you in a year, or I'll see you in a while. But those were the ones who were sitting. They had time. They didn't have the oil of parnasa yet, so they were sitting and learning chassidus and uninterrupted. And in the earlier days, they were the ones who were being trained and how to daven. They were the na'arim, and they were the young blood in Lubavitch. And the latest point where I've seen this mentioned is talking the Rebbe Maharash. We don't have that many letters in the Rebbe Maharash, but one of the letters we have is about a machlekes in Soroka. There was a machlekes between the Na'arim and the Balabatim. So instead of the Bachrim and the Balabatim fighting, it was the Na'arim and the Balabatim. The Na'arim are young and married, and they're it's a hit, hopefully mostly in a good way, and they had gotten into some kind of fight with the Balabatim, and the Rebbe Maharash was intervening. He sent Shluchim down, he sent the Rebbe Zeda, Avram David Lavot was one of the Shluchim to go and resolve whatever the dispute was. And the Rebbe Maharash writes very sharp about Machlekes, very interesting letter, interesting parsha, not very well known, maybe worth its own discussion and exploration. But at any rate, this was the Seder through the Dor of the Maharash. The Rebbe Rashab's Dor is where you see the big shift. Of course, there are many changes taking place in society around us, and that's when the Rebbe Rashab opens a yeshiva, and the yeshivas are Bachrim, and the Bachrim are, the youngest, already in time of the Rebbe Rashab, they already had like bar mitzvah boys, but you have Yeshiva Ktana age, as we call it today, Yeshiva Gedol age, the Iker was the Yeshiva Gedol, the Beis Medrash age. So Beis Medrash has 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, they're not getting married, the Adrab, the Iker is the time they spend in yeshiva before they get married, and then after you get married, is how much time do you have left? So that whole model that we're familiar with today, that we take for granted today, that's only from the Rebbe Rashab and on. Now, why is that relevant to what I'm talking about? Because if you think about it, the Rebbe Rashab, from when he opened the yeshiva, was sort of saying his main audience for his maamarim, for his chassidus, was Bachrim. So it seems logical to surmise that the Rebbe Rashab didn't see it fitting to talk about more adult themes to an audience of Bachrim. And that set the tone for the maamarim afterwards. So a whole dimension that's very visible in earlier datas sort of gets sidelined from the Rebbe Rashab and on, which, of course, if you're a Bachur Yeshiva, that I guess should still be the case. But once people get married, it seems chaval that everyone should lose out on I would say, the riches of teachings and ideas that very much engage with this part of life, this aspect of life that you can find in the earlier datas. And in fact, in the past, I had already previously noticed the theme of Sfira being related to Hefsek Tara, Shiv Nekiyim. I noticed it before in the Marash's Torah. And the last time I was looking into it, I don't know if I saw this particular maamar, but there are a few other maamarim where the Rebbe Rashab mentions it in passing. So I noticed that there's a certain maamar, the Rebbe Maharash, that mentions this, and there's a maamar, the Rebbe Rashab, that's based on it. And if you look and you compare both of them, and I haven't gone and looked it up again, but this is what I made a note of at the time, you can literally see how the Rebbe Maharash in that portion stated things a bit more explicitly, and you could see how the Rebbe Rashab in that portion literally deleted a line. It would seem pretty obviously for this reason. So it's just kedai for the grown-up adult crowd who may be interested in this. And of course, today a lot of the speakers, the darshanim, do try to blend ideas of chassidus with concepts of marriage and intimacy with varying levels of accuracy. But the truth is that if you actually look in the earlier Daitas, you'll see that the Rebbeim themselves did actually speak about it at some length, and there's a variety of sources. And this is one such source. So this has been a pretty long Hakdama. It's almost half an hour in, and we didn't get to the Inyan itself. So let's continue. So like I mentioned, there really are two topics here, two themes that came up in previous conversation. The question of attitude towards the concept of nida, of separation. And the second question being this: is there a blurry line between the world of intimacy, of passion, of physical love, and spiritual passion, spiritual love? And there's probably a lot to say on the topic, but in this Torah Gufa, we see that there are two parts to this Torah, or multiple, like we said in the Rebbe Maharash summary. The first was Nida v'Hafsik Tara, and the second one was B'yem Chassidus Zeh Matan Torah. So I'm going to focus in this discussion less on the Nida v'Hafsik Tara and more on the B'yem Chassidus Zeh Matan Torah, because that part of the maamar mamish focuses on this nakuda, on this question of the connection, relationship, the line one can draw between the two things, the physical and the spiritual. So a proper exploration on the Nida v'Hafsik Tara part would have to be saved for another occasion. If there's an interest, I would certainly consider doing it soon, but we'll see. But to focus more on the second point, so just to jump into the maamar, I'm going to try to avoid reading too much of the Hebrew text. I'm going to try to just convey what the maamar is saying in my words in English. But here and there, if there's a starker line, I'll probably read it. So just to catch us up where the maamar started and how we get to this discussion, the maamar begins with this Tzemach Tzedek, quotes a Zohar. The Zohar already says that Sfiras Ha'omer is like Sfiras Zayin Nekiyim. So he explains that Galus is compared to Nida, so they were in Galus Mitzrayim, which is a state of Nida, and Yitzias Mitzrayim is to leave that state of Nida. So Yitzias Mitzrayim is the Hafsik Tara. So first you have to cut off the Nefesh Bahamas, cut off the Ra, that's the Hafsik Tara. And then you need to count Zayin Nekiyim. You have to make sure, you have to go carefully make sure that you're clean. That takes 7 days. So in Sfira that translates into 7 times 7. Then he says, V'achar Sfira tzarech liyas tvila. So then the next step is tvila. V'achar kach hayichod. And then in the physical mashal, that's when there's the union between husband and wife. So just as the mashal, so the same goes for the nimshal. You have to disconnect from the ra, that's the hafsik tara. Then there's Sfiras Ha'omer Zayin Nekiyim. Then there's tvila, and then there's Jem Chassidus Zu Matan Torah Hu Hayichud Ha'elyon. So there's the equivalent of that physical union is the spiritual union on Shavuos Matan Torah. That's Jem Chassidus, and the Torah is a party to that. The Torah is part of that. So here the Rebbe Maharash, I'm gonna mainly use the Hanach of the Rebbe Maharash here. That's printed in Tafresh Lamed. The Rebbe Maharash says, really, we need to discuss why do Chazal say B'yem Chassidus Zu Matan Torah? Hashem is a chasen, the Yidden are a kala. Maamar Amusker, parenthetically, last year Shavuos, they gave a shtickle drasha about the question of who's the chasen and who's the kala in the story of Matan Torah. If you actually pay attention, you'll notice that we're inconsistent. Sometimes we say that the Eibishter is the chasen and the Yidden are the kala. And sometimes we say that the Yidden are the chasen and the Torah is the kala. And if you look at the piyutim and the Shtar Ksuba, this whole literature that's out there, you'll notice that they too are inconsistent and they could be categorized and classified by which model they go with. We're not getting into that, but here we're going with Darch Klan chassidus. It's certainly much more typical to say the Eibishter is the chasen and the Knesset Yisrael are the kala. So the Rebbe Maharash asks, maybe it should be a pashta question. Lama himshilu matan Torah liyichud chasen v'kala mashal gashmi zor ma'od. Like, is this really appropriate? Is this an appropriate mashal? And he uses this term mashal gashmi zor ma'od. Now, the term mashal gashmi reminds me that you find this term mashal gashmi in chassidus in a number of places. Sometimes he'll just say it casually, like, oh, to give a mashal gashmi, da 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 da. So a number of years back, one of the chshuvei, I don't know what to say, but one of the chashuvei fashteyas and chassidus wrote ha'ara asking, what's the significance of the line mashal gashmi? You even have the lashon in Tanya. So what's the word of mashal gashmi? So at the time I wrote a whole response, and I said if you actually search for all the places where mashal gashmi is used, it's pretty clear that mashal gashmi, even when it's invoked without explanation, seems to almost be somewhat apologetic. It's to say, we're talking about something spiritual and abstract, and here's a grabba mashal. It's essentially the equivalent in Hebrew of saying, here's a grabba mashal. And I pointed out, attack in a few places, even in the earlier datas, sometimes there is more of a disclaimer that even though it's a mashal gashmi, especially if it's about a yoni zivug, if that's the mashal, so you'll see a bit of a, well, yeah, okay, yeah, it is a mashal gashmi, but this is the mashal we're going to go with. So here, it's asked as a question, why are we using these types of mishalim? It's a mashal gashmi, it's a grabba mashal zormoid, it's like inappropriate. Surely they could have found other mishalim. Says we have a medrash. The medrash says there are 10 times Knesset Yisrael is called the Kala, 6 in Shir HaShirim. Shir HaShirim, of course, is ground zero for using this kind of language. But it's not just Shir HaShirim, it's 6 in Shir HaShirim and 4 in other places as well. So it's not just, it's throughout Tanakh, throughout the Ksavim, our holy writings, our holy scriptures. And the maamar continues. He asks, "V'yoser any movement?" He says, "There's an even more shocking medrash." This is the medrash he quotes. It's a medrash in Bereshis Rabbah, the story of Shechem and Dinah. And this is what it says. The medrash says, it says, "V'yidaber chamor itom leimar." And this is what the medrash says. It quotes the medrash and the maamar, or paraphrases it a little. The medrash says, "Gimel l'shonis shel chiba chibe v'kadosh baruch hu Yisrael." That when Hashem loves the Yidden, when he's mechabev the Yidden, there are 3 lashonos of love, of affection. Dveika, chasheka, chashika, and chafetza. Where do we see these 3 words? Dveika, because it says va'atem adveikim. And where do we see chasheka? Because it says rakba v'secha chashak. That's how it's quoted here in the maamar. In the medrash it says loy merudchem mikol ha'amim chashek Hashem. And chafetza is ki'atem tiyuli eretz chayfetz. Okay, so fine, that's beautiful. We're used to that at this point. Doesn't raise an eyebrow. But the medrash continues and says, "V'kulam," the way it's paraphrased here in the maamar, "V'kulam lo'lamdu ela miparshasai shel oisei rasha." And where did we get all this language from? Where did we get this sprach? Kulam lo'lamdu ela miparshasai shel oisei rasha. We learned it all. We got the lingo. We picked up the sprach from the story of Shechem. Shechem, how often in Tanakh do you have a story describing someone's infatuation, someone's passion, a young man's passion for a young woman? But here's one such story. It's notable for that reason. And if you look through the story, if you pay attention, you'll see that the degree of his passion is given expression in a number of ways. And in fact, it uses those same 3 terms. There's a lashon that says, Shechem b'ni chashka nafshe. I think that's this possibly daber chamor itom leimar Shechem b'ni chashka nafshe. So it talks about his cheshek. And then earlier it says vatidbak nafshe. That he had this dveikos. He was cleaving, attached to her. And it says ki chafetz bevas Yaakov. So we have gimel lashon shel chiba dveika chasheka chafetza. We use these when we use them for the Eibishter. They seem like these very lofty terms, but they're essentially in the context of Shechem. They seem a little bit like grabba terms. Chashka nafshe, vatidbak nafshe, chafetz b'vas Yaakov, kulam leilamdu el miparshas shel oisei rasha. And that's all the medrash says. Medrash doesn't have a punchline. That's the medrash says. These gimel lashonos come from Shechem. The way the medrash is printed in Bereshis Rabbah, the way I saw it, the lashon there is not as strong. It's v'anu lameidim oisa bi parsha shel rasha hazeh, but it seems to essentially functionally be the same point that we learn it from here. And if you look in the medrash adds there's another man da'amar there who says it's another 2, not just those 3, but also ava v'dibur, because we have the Eibishter, you have ahafti eschem and dabru alev Yerushalayim, and similarly with Shechem you also have these lashonos of Vayidaber, Aliba, or I don't have the psukim in front of me, and he loved her. So you have even 5 lashonos if you look in the medrash. By the way, if you look at nothing to do with what we're talking about, but in the same passage in Bereshis Rabbah, there's an interesting phrase that I I don't remember running into before. It says there, La'olam in Yisrael noisen etzboi b'toich piv shel ebekachavim, or the uncensored version Tchila. LMK Nosan Ebekachavim, or the uncensored version, it's boy Tchila b'toich piv shel Yisrael. He doesn't put his finger in an Eino Yehudi's hand unless the Eino Yehudi puts his finger first in the Yid's mouth, which is an interesting expression. The whole thing is interesting, and apparently it seems to be expressing that Yidden don't start up. They don't start first. If the brothers did something violent, but they didn't initiate, they were reacting, which seems like it has resonance and relevance in this era where Yidden are accused, that people are complaining about how that they're being noisen its bomb, but who's first, who's second? Okay, without getting too off track here. So that's in Bereshis Rabbah and also Medrash Tillim Mizmach Beis. So the maamar brings it in. I looked; it's almost not brought elsewhere in chassidus. So that itself, it's an interesting medrash, and it's being quoted here to say, wait a second. The medrash itself is saying that in order to learn, in order to speak, to have a framework, to have a language, to talk about the Eibishter and the Yidden, we had to go and find the biggest oisvarf, the most nidrige man, Shechem, and the nidrige thing he did, and we looked to that story for inspiration, and then now we have the words, we have the terminology, we have the framework. Now we can go and talk about the Eibishter and the. Really, is that really the case? Why would that be the case? So before he answers, he mentions another question. It says, "V'ahavta," you're supposed to love the Eibishter, and then it says, "V'hayu advarim," we go straight into talking about torah. They're supposed to learn torah. So the question is, what's the connection between loving Hashem and torah? And Rashi says that if you learn torah, if you learn torah, then you'll know about the Eibishter and love the Eibishter, because we're told to love the Eibishter, but we don't know how. So through torah, you come to love the Eibishter. That point will be key for the upcoming discussion. But he asks, sometimes, chassidus says these very lofty things, and sometimes you wonder, well, is that the reality? Is that what we see? So here the maamar asks the question for you. We see plenty of people are learning, and there are probably some people that do have love for the Eibishter, and they don't have too much torah. So what's the connection? Torah and love? So now we start getting into the answer. She says, first, what's talking the mashal b'yim chasinasei? So he says that understanding the biology of how a man and woman, husband and wife are intimate is relevant to understanding the place that Torah holds in our lives in Yiddishkeit. And this is how he says it, that just like in a yichud chasen v'kala, which he means begashmius, the intimacy, the union, the ikr is what the chasen is mashpia to the kala, and that hashpa, that tipa, even though it's very gashmistic, but chassidus we always say that it comes from the mayach, and then it goes through the spine, and then it becomes into a gashmistic tipa. But really, it comes from the mayach ha'av, and that's how he's able to reproduce b'moiled b'doimaloi. So on the one hand, it goes a long journey and turns into something as gashmistic as that, but it starts off as something very lofty within the person's existence, within his body. It comes from a very lofty place. So that's the perfect mashal for what we say about Torah and mitzvahs. Torah is the Eibishter's chachma and ratzon, so that's like the tipa in the mayach. But this is generally the basic point is should be fairly well known, Tanya. But it's nislabish in gashmius. You have tzitzis, tzemer gashmi, tefillin, klaf gashmi, sukkah, lulav. And here he touches ice in an interesting way. He says the lamed beis chutei at tzitzis, the 32 strings of tzitzis. That's the physical manifestation of the lamed beis nesivas chachma, the 32 paths of chachma. And when you wear the tzitzis, you're drawing down the 32 paths of chachma. And through Sfiras Omer, we count Hayoim this, Hayoim that, even though it's a deeper Gashmi, but you're drawing down the Mem Tes Shari Bina. So you have the Lama Beis Nesivas Chachma, you have the Mem Tes Shari Bina, so for that you have Tzitzis, for that you have Sfiras Omer, you're being Mamshech, the physical manifestation draws the spiritual equivalent of the Mem Tes Shari Bina. And the Daled bottom of Tefillin is Daled Moichen, Rashi Binu Tam. Sagt der Maharash, v'leimotzu chachamenu zal moshel hayoser doime sheyiyeh atzmius v'yislabish begashmius ki im miyichud chasem ekala. Our sages could not find a better moshel that represents these two extremes, that it starts off as atzmius and ends up as gashmius. The only equivalent is the physical union, the yichud between husband and wife, chasem ekala. The tipa comes from the mayach and turns into what it turns into, and is given to is mushpa to the kala. And al derech zeh, the Torah takes atzmius chachmasu ritzaynai, and it turns into mitzvahs, tzemer gashmi, klaf gashmi. Says Hagam, there's other mishalim, the shpor sarav la talmud, but any dermal and imshal, because that's not being mashpia atzmius, that's being mashpia ha'ara ba'alma. But you want to find the mashal, it's chachmasu ritzaynai, it's the zach alein, that's your mashal. And that's why they're mamshel yichud chasim v'kala, because through kiyum Torah mitzvahs begashmius, you're mamshel chachmas yidatzone. That's b'yom chasunos. That's where this language that we're using in this mind, b'yom chasunosai. That's why that language exists. That's why it's so important. So now that we established this point, he says, now he goes back to the question. So back to the question of Shechem. Why do we have to learn avas hamakim me'oisei rasha? Me'oisei rasha, from that rasha. And the way he paraphrased it, according to kulam le'lamdu, it's like we have no other way to learn. The way we learn it is from Shechem. So he says, for that you have to know there's an Ohr Hachaim. Now what's cute here is that sometimes younger people or whatever sometimes confuse the Pirush Ohr Hachaim HaKadosh on Chumash with the chelik of Shulchan Aruch, which is called Ohr Hachaim. The Rosh Tevis for Ohr Hachaim is Aleph Vav Ches. Aleph Vav for Ohr and Ches for Chaim. The Rosh Tevis for the Ohr Hachaim is usually Aleph Vav Hey Ches. Aleph Vav for Ohr and Hey Ches for Hachaim. Interestingly, in this Hanacha, the Maniach wrote Aleph Vav Ches. So when I saw it, I smiled. I said, okay, I'm pretty sure this is Taka the Ohr Hachaim. And Taka, if you look in Tafresh Nun Beis, where you have the Hanacha of the Rebbe Maharash and Tzemach Tzedek, there Taka says Aleph Vav Hey Ches. It's very clear we're talking about the Pirush Ohr Hachaim. And this is what is quoted from Ohr Hachaim. It says in Tafresh Lamed, Ohr Hachaim ala Torah v'ahavta b'chol levavcha, and Chazal say b'chol levavcha b'shnei yetzerecha. So the Yetzer Hara is also part of the picture. So he says, if you look at Ohr Hachaim there, he doesn't quote it, but he says, if you look at Ohr Hachaim there, move on midvarav, and this is the quote from the maamar from Tafresh Lamed. Shal Pirush, the pshat is, sheme'avas v'taivas hayetzer, yecholim lahavin ha'eich shenitzrach le'ohevas HaKadosh Baruch Hu. From the passion, from the taivas, the desires of our Yetzer, that can teach us, that yecholim lahavin kemen verstehen, wie medarf lieb haben der Eibishter. Ha'eich shenitzrach le'ohevas HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's the pshat in the Medrash from Shechem, v'kulim loy lamdu, that in order to understand the Eibishter, Chasheka, the Dveika, Chafetza with the Yidden, you got to first look at Shechem for the framework, for the understanding. And so the Ohr Hachaim is expressing the same idea as that Medrash. If you look in this, because this part is so interesting and notable to me, so I'm also going to quote from how the Rebbe Maharash wrote it, B'Shem Tzemach Tzedek. So if you look at Tafresh Nun Beis, in Tafresh Nun Beis, it's, I made a note of which page it is. In Tafresh Nun Beis, it's page Lamed Aleph and onward. So Tafresh Lamed Shin Nun Beis and onward, and in Tafresh Nun Beis, page Lamed Aleph and onward. So the way this passage appears in Tafresh Nun Beis, it says that in the Ohr Hachaim, Am v'ahavta b'chol avavcha v'hoy dvar me'elech, Chazal say v'beis yitzerecha. So he says, Pirush Ohr Hachaim, shemitoich ha'yetzer hara atabo le'ohev es ha'torah shehu avas HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As we'll see here in the model here in this maamar, it's technically appreciating the Torah, loving the Torah, by which, by extension, you love the Eibishter. As we just established just a moment ago, it's dafka the Torah that's nimshal to the Yichud Gashmi. So mitoich ha'yetzer hara atabo le'ohev es ha'torah shehu avas HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'hu mimasha nuroyim she'ava v'acheshek sheyesh le'inyan ha'yichud, the desire, the urge, the biological urge that a person has, inyan hayichud, essentially for the act of intimacy, the drive that a person experiences, is very strong, very powerful. As we see from Shechem, so he was in the throes of this urge. This is a very great desire. And this is our model for how to love the Eibishter. Now, because this is so interesting and so notable, I'm going to quote also the Ohr Hachaim himself. The Ohr Hachaim, if you look it up, it's on Taka v'hoyu advonim ha'ela. So the Ohr Hachaim says, what's the triple Lashonos, Chalavavcha, Chanavshcha, Medacha. So he says that there's 3 levels in Ava, 3 levels in physical passion. Chalavavcha is Keneged, Chemdas Halev, the desire, the passion, that the physical, biological passion that a person has. He says, Keneged that, Chalavavcha. He says, when it comes to other stuff, it comes to the desire for food, for wealth, it's not to such a great extent. If a person's hungry, you can hold yourself back and not eat. Desire, a beautiful woman, and especially if the desire keeps on growing in his heart, he'll be so in the throes, so under the sway of this feeling, of the sense of this desire, that he can't control himself anymore, unlike food. It's going to force him to do something he didn't want to do. As everyone knows, love can make people act stupid. So generally they wouldn't act so stupid for anything else, but this makes people act irrationally. This is the Ohr Hachaim. I was surprised. I guess I should have been more bucky, but the Ohr Hachaim is able to use such powerful, vivid descriptions. Say Lamad. See, the whole story of Tzemach Tzedek on the Pashut level is he had to overcome the Chemnas Halev, and that's the big chiddush that in the throes of that, Yosef managed to overcome it. It's still told till today as a major chiddush that Yosef accomplished. So it's Keneged Gedr Zeh. So when you are aware of that, when you consider that, so Keneged Zeh, the Yibshir says that the Avdas Hashem Lekach should be b'chol avavcha, that you should work and developing your Avas Hashem to an extent at Gedr Shiyasig Hergish Belivoy Kachol Shir Shiyach Lalev Lahargish Boy, to try to bring your passion to the Yibshir up to the limits of how passionate your heart can be. Ulezeh Diktik Lemar B'chol, and that's why it says B'chol Avavcha, with your whole heart. He says Lefi Shahalev, and this is again interesting language from Ohr Hachaim. Lefi Shahalev Yachmoid B'chol Isha. Really, this desire for anyone. Ubi Yoser B'na, certainly for a pretty one. Ubi Yoser B'klilas Yofi, and even more so for someone who's of the ultimate beauty. Ubi Yoser B'mi Shein Lamayliman, and for sure for the one who's the ultimate in beauty. So we know what the heart is capable of in that context. So it should be also to that tremendous level. He says this is something that if you taste it, if you manage to get a taste of this, you'll know what it is, and it's going to be the most unbelievably beautiful, sweet thing in the world. So that's how the Ohr Hachaim teaches b'chol vavcha. Then he explains b'chol nafshecha is like the equivalent of the desire for food, and b'chol meidacha is like the desire, I think, for money. And he explains each one has a mila, the other one doesn't have. So when it comes to b'chol meidacha, he says the mila is that you have a desire for food, but then you go and you eat something and you calm down for a bit. And he says u'kamoikein b'chol vavcha taivas liboy acher gemar ma'isa derech gaver ba'alma, also yishtana davar etzlei ad achar zman. Then you also take a break. So for that, you need b'chol meidacha for a more constant, ongoing love. Ayin sham. I'm just quoting the part that's relevant, but the Ohr Hachaim is very definitively leading very strongly into the comparison, the physical and spiritual comparison, the physical passion and the spiritual passion. Now back to the Rebbe Maharash Tafresh Lamed. So we've already made this point, we've established this point, very interesting, very powerful point. But what comes next is perhaps just as interesting, if not more. And before I continue, I'll point out that there's one other mention of this Indian, of this sugya. We find that in the Sefer of the Rebbe Maharash, Tafresh Lamed Tes, by then the Rebbe Rashab was already writing Hanachas, and the Rebbe Maharash had said a maamar bekeshet to chasana. We don't know of whose. We have a few mystery chassinas of the Rebbe Maharash saying mamari chasana, but we don't know who. Bechlal, throughout the Doros, talking about mamarim that have this teichen, often drushe chasana from already the first dar, often tend to be more explicit in this kind of way. And I've already been saying for years that those who are interested in the topic, we need to really spend time and focus on the drushe chasana to see what messages they contain. So there's a drush chasana for the Maharash there, and that which the Rebbe Rashab also wrote down. And then after he wrote it down, there's like another small shtickle, like an additional, a hesber, maybe the Maharash told it balpet to the Rebbe Rashab, or whatever the case is. The Rebbe Rashab wrote another short hesber. It says, hesber al hanal, but the teichen of that maimer, yesh loimar mima shekasa b'Ohr Hachaim b'inyan kriya shema havaya echad, which, even though it says havaya echad, but l'chayr it's referring to this Ohr Hachaim that we just quoted now. And the Rebbe Rashab continues, hisbonenus min tavas hamashpia el hamakabel. The hisbonenus of taivas hamashpia, the desire, the urge, the drive that the mashpia, the male has, el makabel, to his partner. Commission is bar, but usfartim. So in one line, the Rebbe Rashab says that, if you look in usfartim, this is another piece of the puzzle as to when it was said, or where it appeared. So we have Tafresh Lamed, we have Tafresh Mem Beis, we have here in Tafresh Lamed Tes, it's referencing the Ramaschal Svartim, it's Retzich Darten, but Ohr Hachaim and the hisbonenus min tavis hamashpia lemakabel. And that's, seeing that summarized that way, the hisbonenus, it really caught my eye. But if, as we'll continue, we'll see that the next piece of this Maimer Tak and Tafresh Lamed, and in the earlier version, which is printed in Tafresh Nun Beis, the Maimer now goes on to literally turn this idea into a hisbonenus. What do I mean by when I say turn it into a hisbonenus? So I don't want to be Meidach. We've been Meidach already quite a lot at this point. But anyone who learns the Alter Rebbe's maamar will certainly notice this, but it's really all the Rebbeim. There's parts of the maamar where the maamar is explaining an inyan, discussing an inyan, but then there are parts where the maamar very clearly, consciously launches into a prescribed hisbonenus, and you'll see it in the middle of the Alter Rebbe's maamar, where in the middle of making a point, he'll say, "Oh, the person has to think about the Eibishter's hoids, the connection between the Eibishter and the Oilmus and the Malachim, and often go off into the Malachim, how the Malachim, what they know, what they experience, and what their Ava is, and that's all just Hoidaretz V'Shamayim, and the Eibishter is much greater than that." But it's very clearly sort of being stated as, here is a sequence of thoughts to focus on. Here's a meditation. And this is something I want to be ma'arich in elsewhere. I know consciously myself, speaking for myself, but for many years, whenever I'd get to that part, it would be, oh, okay, do we have to read it? Can we skip it? It's one of those, but maybe now the time has come to actually develop an appreciation for what these passages are, and that has to be discussed. But that's what's happening essentially here in the maamar, is that we shift from explanation mode to here's what a person should actually be misboinen in, and it's literally, as the Rebbe Maharash summed it up, hisbonenus min taivas hamashpia el makabel. This is what it says in Tafresh Lamed. The inyan is, we explained that what's the milas yichud chasim mekala, essentially physical intimacy, that the hashpah comes from atzmis hamayach. Now, where does the mayach come from? The mayach comes from chachma shebamachas da'asiyah, and chachma da'asiyah comes from chachma d'machas d'yitzira, and shayra sharsham is from machas da'atzilus, which is shayra shayishtalshlus. So what do we see? That the hashpah hamayach, what the physical hashpah that a male is mashpia, comes ultimately from a very low level in ishtalshlus, machas da'asiyah. And yet, and yet, for such a lowly physical act, for something as low in the hierarchy as that, yet it's so powerful, so passionate, that this Shechem ruined his life. Well, first he did what he did, then he ended up ruining his life, all for something that's that low in the tree of Ishtalshlus. So when you think about that, and when you run through that entire sequence in your mind, and then you think about the fact that Shechem, torah, and even Asiya is in Arech Yitzira, because it says Af Asisiv Af Hifsaka Inyan. So it's in Arech. And then Klos Bia is in Arech Legabi Atzilus, because Bria is called Bria, because it's Yeshmi Ayin Legabi Atzilus. And Atzilus already is Gilia Helam from Ein Sof, and whatever you have in Elam has this through Ribu Yishtalshlus Tzimtzumim, and then through Bria Yeshmi Ayin, because first you need tens of thousands of Ishtalshlus, and then you still can't get Gashmias. Again, like I said, this is literally like a hisbonenus sequence. You still can't get Gashmias unless you create an additional Helam Hamahava from the Mishava, because without that Helam, the Ruchnius would never turn into Gashmias, even through tens of thousands of Ishtalshlus. So the hishavas is through first Ishtalshlus and then Bria Yeshmi Ayin. So that's at that end. But at the beginning, Atzilus is Gilia Helam, so Ein Arech Bia Legabi Atzilus. In Atzilus Gufa, Ein Arech Malchus Legabi Chachma. And Mikol Shekein Legabi the Darg of Chakim V'lo B'Chachma, which we said, that's the real Shadish of Torah, Chakim V'lo B'Chachma Yediyah. So Harei Zakal V'Chomer Em Nimtza B'Dover Sheshor Shem Yechachma the Malchus Da'asiyah Kol Kach Av. A person should think about this world of passion, the drive that a person has, the libido person has, is ultimately so low, and yet it's so powerful. So it's as bonus to the connection of mitzvahs, which are an expression of torah. That's the nimshal. And the next natural step is that through you get to the ahavta. And he circles back around and says, and that's like what Ohr Hachaim said, to me'avas ha'yetzer yecholim lahavim, kama shenitzrach le'avas HaKadosh Baruch Hu. From the avas ha'yetzer, we can understand how much we have to love the Eibishter. Not stam a gedank, a word of inspiration. The maamar is saying you have to sit and be misboinen in this hisbonenus of a gansei the ishtalshlus, and where the ava that we experience fits in, and then compare it and contrast it, that it's the same thing, but in the ein arich to what Torah represents, and from that you have And again, because it's so notable, I will also quote part of the Lashon from the way it appears in Torah and Beis, which is how the Rebbe Maharash wrote it from the Tzemach Tzedek. This is how it says it there. What's the taiva? What's the drive? The drive is the physical release, essentially. That's the male libido. The male drive is to that release. Lashpos hatipa shazo inyan hayichud, which is the nature of physical intimacy. So, meaning if you break it down, when a person is experiencing love, experiencing passion, what do they really want? What they really want is to have physical intimacy. And when they have physical intimacy, what do they really want to do? Ultimately, it's that act of being mashpia the tipa. So that's really what it all comes down to. So again, this term hisbonenus, it's taka being prescribed as a hisbonenus. And the mayach comes from Chacham machas ta'asiyah, machas ta'asiyah, machas yitzir, machas yitzir, machas dabriya, machas dabriya, machas ta'atzilus. And by the way, when we talk about hisbonenus, dafka, this detail and the steps is very important to what a hisbonenus would look like, to sort of walk through step by step. So he's enunciating, he's elaborating, he's expressing every single step, because that's the template of a hisbonenus. Achine, that's zum Rabbim, the Vrambal Ligvol, Avo Bikain, Yeshlos a Taiva Gedolemoid, so Kal Vachayim Vakoshikain. As a darf sein, Ava Vacheshek, Limud Atoira, Chachmasar de Tzerne, Chachmadat Silos, Inarech Klal, that's Bachol Vavcho, Vesi Tzeracha, Sheme Ava, Se Yetzahara, Linyan HaYichud. The drive, the desire the Yetzahara has for that, Yechilm Nesboinen, so you literally have a fire to hisbonenus. So you can derive from that through hisbonenus how much you have to love learning Torah, which is comparable to hashpos hatipa. And that's this word of you can get to v'ahavta because of this mashal of the hashpos hatipa. So there in Tofish and Beis, which is really from the Tzemach Tzedek, he concludes this section. It says, "V'zel b'im chassidus is matan Torah, shematan Torah yi bechinas hayichud, shalachinim shalal chassidus, shekamoy inyan hayichud or hashpos hatipa moyach kacha hu inyan haTorah she bechinas hashpos hachmas yitzoni yisbarach, but it's in Dvarim Gashmim. So that's b'im chassidus is matan Torah. That's the pshat matan Torah shvuos. It's not an association that we need to push away, that we have to sideline. No, that's taka the pshat, that this is just like that. And that's the section of these mamarim that I wanted to discuss here. Just should be a shtickle davar shalem. So just a few highlights from the Hamshach, the Maamar and Tafish Lamed, and both really continue. Like we saw in the summary, then there's the whole thing about Sa'odim. We're not going to get into all that by Nichas. But just bekitzer, so he says, so that's why back to the word of, so that's why you need to have sektara. You need to have sektara in order to get to the yichud that we just explained at great length. That's the yichud of matan Torah. So in order for that, you can't do that in a matzav of nida. Then you can have the yichud. So that's why you need to have sektara and the zayin akiyim, and then the tvila. He explains what the tvila is, and that's connected to the shar hanun of shavuos. That's the tvila. And then once you get through all those steps, then on shavuos you could have nesinas haTorah shehu hayichud elyon, like it says v'olei chukasai. So that's svaitam lechem. You have to work on your midas, but first you have to have a machnas hashabbos to have sektara, and then you have to bring the oimer, as he explains, and how that fits into the bir and hamidas, and you have the memtes sha'arim, and then you get to the shara nun. That's the conclusion, and that's the tvila. Ba'achgach yuchaliyas matan Torah shehu hayichud. So that's where it fits in the larger framework of the maamar. But like I said, this section in particular seems highly notable, highly noteworthy. And like I said, the Rebbe Rashab even elsewhere referenced it as, this is the maamar that makes this point. This is something that Tzemach Tzedek, Rebbe Maharash, maybe the Rebbe Rashab as well, are saying this is something to be misboinen in. It's prescribed hisbonenus and Chabad chassidus. So back to the question that we began with. Let's say in the scenario where someone gets married and they experienced something they didn't experience before. Is that completely unrelated? Is it confusing two things that are unrelated? Lafi this maamar, I would say, I would argue that nishta zay pashat, that lafi what this maamar is acknowledging is that there is a connection, but obviously it's not literally synonymous and interchangeable. But the two things are, one is mishtalsha from the other, and Obviously, also it's interesting the emphasis and the comparison to the Ava for Limud HaTorah, the Cheshek for Limud HaTorah Dafka. Interestingly, because Dafka the Torah is that act of Yichud. But this idea that the fact that a person can experience these things, can experience these feelings, these desires, this like I said, unlocking this dimension of physicality, does actually seem to, in a way, if someone is a bacher, someone wasn't one of the Na'arim, back in the times of the Mittel Rebbe Maharash, someone's a bacher and hasn't experienced what that is, and then has now learned to somewhat experience what that means, to a certain extent, they have at this point unlocked much of what chassidus seems to be talking about, which is having similar strong feelings for the Eibusher. Again, like the Ohr Hachaim as well articulated it so blatantly that you literally have to look to one in order to model it and apply it to the other. So I believe this is a very valuable, very interesting point. I imagine, I assume that many will find this to be of interest. And of course, as always, I'm open to artists' feedback. If you want to share this with others, of course, feel free to pass it along. Again, obviously, you want to make sure that it's the right crowd, the right person. You don't want to, so if it's not the right age, not the right stage, then obviously from the Rebbe Maharash on, we learn, I guess, that it's not appropriate for everybody, but certainly it's there. It's part of the teachings of Chabad chassidus, and it probably is important for us to know about it. And even though this is technically a Parshas Ohr maamar, but of course, Ohr is the parsha where the mitzvah of Sfira is articulated, so that's why it's a Dibur Maskell from Parshas Ohr. But of course, it's relevant and applicable to the entire span of Sfiras Ohr, and we're still counting down. We're still trying to get from the Hefsek Torah to Zayin Akiyim to the Tefillah and the Yichud of Matan Torah. So this is something to perhaps think about, contemplate, consider as we are heading into Matan Torah.